Welcome, Eli Dourado. This is a dream come true. You wrote one of my favorite new blog posts. I'm feeling for some serious psychological reason that we will unpack here. This is not really a salon. This is a group therapy for Eli to investigate what makes him so obsessed with sociopolitical collapse and social collapse. You wrote this wonderful piece based on which the salon is going to develop. We will share the link in the YouTube comments as well and on our Discord. Maybe not everybody here knows how deeply this piece was inspired by a guy called Joseph Tainter and his 1988 book, if I'm correct, on the collapse of complex societies. We like to flatter ourselves that we are citizens of complex societies, and that's so cool. But you are a little bit more careful building on Tainter, and you say that there's C1, C2, and C3, 3 different stages of complexity, and be careful where you are on that scale. So we will explore that briefly today, and I will try to ensure that everybody gets to ask a question. I think iPhone is my friend Taylor, fellow Interact host. If not, hi iPhone. Eventually people will name their kids that. It's just a matter of time. Eli, tell us the story of how this piece came to be, and also how did Ben Reinhardt write a companion piece that is still a secret until I just said this. Tell us the story. What was
of course.
What was this midlife crisis that led us here?
Well, thanks first of all for having me. This is great to be here with you all and to have like an in-depth conversation on something that I care about, obviously. So there was a point last year where I started really thinking seriously about sort of the wave of populism, and I would even call it nihilism. Sort of nihilistic populism.
Yeah, you call it nihilistic populism, right? That's such
the
moniker.
And it's sort of a view, I think, that we're starting to see, not just in the U.S. but other countries as well, where the sort of the preference is to poke at your opponents more than it is to even accomplish anything substantive in politics, and I'm worried about that, right? And I think this is unhealthy. And I was thinking about, well, where does this lead? And then I think the other strand of thought that was going through my head was there's all this concern about existential risk, AI safety. What are the risks that we face as a society? And I thought, this is. This is another risk, and it's different from the other ones because the basic cause is that we're not growing fast enough. We're not delivering on increased quality of life. So it's structurally like the opposite of so many of the existential risks, where it's like if we develop technologies too fast or something like that, or too in too uncontrolled of a manner, then we risk wiping ourselves out. But I think also if we stagnate, and particularly if we stagnate at certain parts of the income distribution, right? Like if we deliver growth to some parts of the income distribution but not to others, not to the bottom, let's say, then I think that that starts to cause resentment and could lead to this sort of like nihilistic populism. And so that was kind of like the initial like sort of train of thought, realization, and I started just digging around, like, well, who's thought about this, and all roads like kind of like led to this Joseph Tainter book. And so I got the book and started reading it,
that must have been a fun experience, like you're already agonizing over this, and then you find it's like for a hypochondriac, like getting a dictionary of diseases that is just like an alphabetical list of everything that your slight headache might be. So how was that emotionally for you to encounter the Tainter book? What happened, and how did your family and loved ones respond?
Yeah, it was very much like it was so interesting because obviously it was written in 1988, which is, quite a long time ago. And I felt like it felt very fresh, and it felt like it matched a lot with a lot of the symptoms. And so frankly, I just couldn't shut up about it. I was telling, I was like talking to my wife and kids, and I was talking to a bunch of my friends, and they were like, yeah, Eli's on this weird collapse thing. And yeah, I went to a conference or something, and led a session on it. And Ben was there, and got interested, and he wrote his own notes on it that he hasn't published. And we kind of traded notes on it. And so this, what was a couple of months of kind of just socializing it with friends, talking through it. And then I decided, well, I guess at that point I had already decided I'm going to write up some thoughts on this at some point, and try to make the link, and try to get people to see like another aspect of what is at stake, because I do believe, like, basically to fend off collapse, we have to do these things that I want to do anyway, which is to create abundance and growth, and improve people's lives, in a broad-based way across the income spectrum, basically through better governance, through enabling new technologies to develop, through enabling greater societal wealth, right? So that's like kind of the solution. But I kind of, and I think there's the other half of like what's at stake, and what's at stake if we don't. Like, there's a big reward if we do that, which is its own reward, and you don't have to buy the collapse story to believe in that. But I do think that there is like this risk on the other side. If we don't do it, it's like humanity has seen this story before, of when people's lives are not getting better year after year, how that can put societies at risk. So I wanted to be able to tell like both sides of the story, of like, here's the upside if we kind of pursue an abundance agenda, and here's the downside if we don't do that, and if we just allow stagnation, if we allow things to frankly go on their current course. Like, I'm not saying it's likely, or I don't want to put a probability on it, but this is a risk, and I think we should think about it.
Thank you so much. And Taylor is here, who is a complexity scientist and currently at SFI, so I'm very, very glad. A couple of things that really stood out, and I have to admit, I haven't read the Tainter book yet. I really want to do it on the beach on my free day. I feel like this is just what I need. I always take like, the history of Assyrian warfare when I go to the spot. Like I want to like mix it up.
Yes.
So a couple of things that really, really, I found very interesting in your piece, and whether that's you or Tainter, you will tell us. I'm sensing that you are building or updating on Tainter's kind of like
Yes.
Cold War thinking here. So one is that resource depletion does not directly lead to sociopolitical collapse of societies. You basically write that one of the reasons why complexification, to use the Jeff Bezos invention of this word, takes place is to manage the natural depletion of resources. You also reject the decadence theory, which I find really interesting, especially given how much it dominates, certain New York Times opinion writers' pages. Even, I don't know, Mark Anderson toyed around with the ressentiment idea, so the Nietzschean decadence theory. So I'm very curious to hear why you kind of interpret Tainter as fully rejecting it. And the third thing that kind of both surprises me in the negative sense, but also kind of you will contradict yourself a little bit here, is that innovation, or kind of the extension of the energy runway, is only a temporary solution. When you write about this in your piece, I first immediately thought about the Roman Empire, because I do that every 20 minutes anyway. But it's like they are the best example of that, right? Of like basically running away from their own collapse, basically from the first emperor. And it's kind of successful. It makes you think whether every empire is basically this time to fall, and you have a runway before the inevitable entropy kind of like picks you apart. But it also contradicts what you just said, which is that, and I agree with this, like I also want abundance agenda and live my life in that spirit. And you said that, it just requires for us to do what we would be doing anyway. But is that something that just buys us time? Is the process reversible, or is it something where we really just extend the runway to kind of like use dumb startup terms? I'm very, very curious. Why not deflation? Why not decadence and reversible or only temporary solutions? 3 questions.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of like the reason, the causes of collapse, I'm very much like following Tainter there. Like he approaches this like as a social scientist with the sort of like overriding imperative of like actually explaining the data, explaining the cross-sectional variation across like all the cases where collapse has happened, right? And what is a good explanation is one that you can use to explain the times that societies collapsed, the times that they didn't, like which societies collapsed, which ones didn't, etc. Right? And the both the problem with the resources argument is that most of the time societies are able to manage their resources, right? Like so you have to explain like why is it that at particular times some societies have not managed the resources, particularly when the complexity forms in part to manage those resources. So you have societies that create some administration to like steward, its irrigation resources or its other natural resources. So like that is part of the problem that societies complexify in order to address. And then the real question is like, why would they stop responding, to that imperative to like effectively steward resources? And so just saying that societies run out of critical resources is not enough from a social scientific perspective to like explain collapse. And it is like certainly true that a few of the cases of collapse have been in this nexus where the society did run out of resources, but like it's still like an interesting question, like why did that society, like why did they effectively manage their resources for hundreds of years or maybe longer, and then suddenly run out, right? And so Tainter is really, really like serious. This is one of the things that I found very interesting. So like I did my PhD under Tyler Cowen, and Tyler was always like pushing me like explain the cross-sectional variation, why this but not that, why and so like it really resonated with me to come across an archaeologist of all things that was thinking very, very economistically in terms of like how do you explain like this case but not that, and so anyway I found that very compelling. And then with the decadence, it's kind of the same thing, right? Like you have a certain amount, any complex society is going to have a certain amount of like misadministration, a certain amount of the venality sort of at the top, and Tainter is actually very funny. He's very dry, but he's very funny, mocking the decadence arguments. He thinks it's a bunch of woo, basically, and it's quite amusing. And he kind of talks about some of the related arguments more seriously, but then when he gets to just like the pure decadence theories, he's just incredibly he talks about it at some length, but he's also like just very dismissive, and he's like, this is just ridiculous. And it's kind of like I said, kind of amusing to read. And then the last part of your question is escaping me right now. It was
sorry, I think we just some comments in the chat from Sam about the decadence myth of
it's mystical. Yes, but what was the last part of your question?
Right, we cherry pick, and we like if you can look at the most abundant periods in the economic history of the West and find similar decadent literature. We just don't fault those pieces of literature or music for whatever else is happening outside the auditorium or the theater.
Yeah. So I think the last part of your question was about technology, and are we just are we always doomed to collapse in the end because we run out of technology. And I think what's interesting here is this is somewhere where I think I would disagree with Tainter, but Tainter actually I think would be on the side of like maybe the majority even of innovation economists. I don't know. Certainly the innovation economists that are most vocal, they are sort of advancing this theory that we're stagnating because ideas are getting harder to find, right? That we've picked the low-hanging fruit. It's easier to say invent the wheel than it is to like invent a room temperature superconductor. And so we have to invest like increasing effort in future innovation to reap the same returns. I'm less convinced of this. I think that certainly we're nowhere near like the end of technology, right? I think there's plenty more to develop, and I think the argument that that we are we're doomed to like forever increasing resources. I think it's true in some narrow domains, and then less true in others. And there's like unblockings that happen, mostly related to like the ability to abstract away capabilities. And so it's probably true like in particle physics, like very very diminishing returns to innovation and like new discoveries there. But say in biology, I think it's like a golden age. And if you take us like a single biology PhD student, they can do more than a well-funded team like 50 years ago. The best world-class biologists like couldn't sequence an organism, couldn't edit the DNA of an organism, couldn't make new organisms, which we can do with synthetic biology. And so like the sort of breakthroughs that function as platforms, new platforms and abstractions, I think are just wild. And then I think the other thing is that it's not just ideas getting harder to find, it's ideas getting harder to use. And this is kind of again like if we think about all the energy innovation that we've had, say in terms of solar panel prices coming down, well, it's still really hard, it turns out, to like deploy a solar farm because you have to go through a big permitting obstacles and interconnection obstacles and so on. So I would attribute much more of the stagnation to ideas getting harder to use than ideas getting harder to find. And so if we're talking like thousands of years from now, it may be possible that we come to the end of technology, but I don't think that's like a risk that we face, in any kind of intermediate term. I think there's more to discover, and we can sort of outrun complexity forever. And that's particularly true if we think about managing our own complexity and sort of pruning the complexity as we go along, just in virtue of having an analysis like Tainter's book. Like we can do something, we can think about this in ways that the Romans couldn't, because they didn't have Tainter's book. They didn't have a field of archaeology that could look into this. They didn't have as much social scientific data. They didn't have evidence from their own case. And so there's options available to us that were not available in the past.
And the Romans famously declined to choose an industrial revolution a couple of times, right? Because they were worried about, that would go back to your Marxist argument. They were a little bit concerned about empowering certain groups in society. I can't miss that you're wearing an Edge Esmeralda bracelet. So
Yes, I am.
Or you're just coming from there as a.
No, I'm from here in a hotel room in Healdsburg. Yes.
Oh my God, I love it. So do you want to maybe say a couple of words, because talk about abundance mindset, right? And then we will continue with the conversation. Just spotted your bracelet.
Yeah, I think the way I've been thinking about economic growth over the last few years is that we've had amazing progress in a few narrow fields. So things related to computers, bits, software, even electronics manufacturing, although some of that has been imports, and then a few isolated things. Obviously, fracking was a big invention. The sort of cost declines in solar panels, cost declines in batteries have been important, and will continue to be important. But outside of that, we have a lot of stagnation in a lot of physical world activities. So if you think about healthcare, housing, transportation, where we had Concorde and now we don't, actually declined. And so primary energy per capita in the U.S. has gone negative growth since the late 1970s. Transportation speeds, again citing Concorde, has been negative. The cost to develop a drug and bring it to market has gone up orders of like a couple orders of magnitude in the last 50 years, and in real terms, adjusted for inflation, right? So in a lot of these more physical world fields, progress seems to be slowing, and it's really, it's obviously really damaging. And this is the kind of, if you don't have growth in all of these industries, then that also impacts, inequality, right? So if you have a boom in tech in San Francisco, but the rest of the economy is stagnating, well, what does that mean for Arkansas, right? They're gonna be left behind and resentful. And I think this is true even if you redistribute some of the wealth. So I think the data shows that pre-tax inequality has gone way up. Post-tax, once you account for transfers, it's not as bad. But I don't think that really helps in terms of the resentment, and in terms of maybe it helps some, but it doesn't solve it in terms of resentment and so on. Some people, they just feel like they're being left behind and they don't like it.
So you accept
and so I think
you accept the resentment idea, but without the decadence idea.
Usually, I think that's right. I mean, it's not even that decadence is right on some. It could be right on some level, right? But it's not an explanation in terms of it could be a descriptor, right? But not like an explanation for the mechanism of decline. Right. I think that would be how I would differentiate it.
I was very interested in the and this is kind of me not having read the Tainter book, but I'm sure you will be able to summarize it a little bit for us. So on the one hand, there is this argument that we hit a level of complexity to deal with a variety of different challenges, rising populations, the depletion of natural resources, et cetera. And then at some point you have these diminishing returns on this complexity. It becomes almost like a lar pour lar thing, complexity for the sake of complexity. People stop believing in it. Eventually they realize that this is just carrying rocks. It's a futile activity that you only do for making money. And then if you only have a job for making money, then in the weekends you are going to go and get drunk out of your mind and not build meaningful lives. I don't know, you could argue all the way around it. And then you go and talk about the decomplexification, which is a kind of symptom of things being kind of depleted through diminishing returns, where I don't know, you talk about late Roman, going back to in-kind payments, abandoning the currency. But then how can we decomplexify if that's an unhealthy thing? Why doesn't the decomplexification save us? And I'm asking this because the kind of underlying question I have here, because I do think that the system that you're talking about can be applied on a startup, can be applied on a teacher-student relationship, can be applied on even an individual's individual life. Are we talking about societal burnout? And is it if it cannot be solved at least partly by a kind of leaning of it or making it more leaner, is the only way really just to have more? I'm not trying to make a dangerous argument here, but I think I speak with a lot of people in Interact who are struggling with burnout, obviously. These are people, professionals with children, a lot of complexities in their lives. And we almost have monastic instinct when it's too much, you know, like Paul Millard's argument of like basically going off grid, writing your own books, getting like just being an online creator. Like these are decomplexifications of life. And people on the individual level have this living simply, you know, thorough, moving out into a cabin. Like we have that instinct. But what you're talking about means that on the societal level, this doesn't work, because if you're starting to decomplexify a system, but is it really true? I mean, the Second World War was a kind of societal decomplexification, when it was like all these millions of people should just go and work on a war production. So you have this temporary narrowing of economic specialization that to you and Tainter again is, you know, a symptom. But it's only temporary. Like everybody had I'm grossly overgeneralizing. Obviously, there were people who hated the war, who were dissenters, et cetera, but you had a wider scale of consensus and economic despecialization than you had before. And that was somehow good. And it created abundance in the places where the NHS was created in the UK, a huge way to decomplexify, right? Like the doctors are here, follow the queue. But somehow that led to other good things.
So it's interesting. Your examples from the Roman Empire and sort of like reverting to barter, let's say, in a way that's simplification, but I think that Tainter views it, and I think I see his point. I think he views this as actually like adding to complexity, because you need like administrators to sort of, you know, administer a tax code now without money, right? And they need to you can no longer just sort of tax people monetarily and then hire like masons to build the wall. You have to create a system of, you know, partial enslavement where all the different tradesmen have to like come like, you know, one day a week, or I don't know what the schedule was, but like he actually like the Roman Empire actually like you know, like forced their tradesmen to like work on state projects like some fraction of their time instead of just paying taxes and then hiring. So I think he would see that as like an intensification of complexity, because you have more administrators having to do this now, and so I think he would use this as an example of like the complexity actually increases as a system, because like you have to, and then like, okay, this is unpopular, so you have to invest resources in either legitimating it or coercing people, and that requires you know, new administrators, additional soldier salaries, you know, whatever. And so I think that is a you could look at that as an addition to complexity. I think that in the World War II example, I think that there is something very special actually about World War II, which is that we it was like the last time that we were really at a societal level not complacent. And so I think of this like complacency variable as like being key here. And if we, you know, it was kind of like, look, the goal here is to win the war, and we will do whatever it takes to win the war. And like, you know, whether it costs resources or like whether somebody's inconvenienced or like, you know, maybe it's dangerous or whatever, but like we just have to win. And so we're going to kind of do whatever it takes. We're going to like sweep aside the bureaucracy, the red tape, and we're just going to do things. You know, that was, I think, what led to, you know, immense growth, you know, coming out of the war, you know, through about, you know, the early 1970s. So yeah, so I think that's how I think about it. Like we need to be less complacent, and then you know, really think hard about sort of cultivating our own, you know, garden of complexity, right? Like sort of looking at, like, taking a hard look internally at our systems, and, you know, sort of recognizing, okay, like some of these systems were put here for a reason, but it is low marginal value, and we need to stop doing this thing, and sort of just focus on the basics, recognize that there are costs and benefits to all this, and sort of try to increase the amount of resources available through economic growth, but then also try to cultivate the complexity to diminish it, right? Like prune the plant of complexity. And I think if you kind of do those things and have like a less complacent attitude, that's how you survive longer and get to see what happens at the next level of with additional technology and sort of what else the future is able to bring.
I love this, especially because I really deeply believe in earnestness and kind of down with blasé. And there is something about, not just a nihilistic populist kind of extreme version of this, but there's something about the mockery, the attacking the other instead of doing something yourself, that always historically seems deeply symptomatic of people's loss of belief in themselves and in the kinds of corporations that they can build. But there are some complacencies that I want. I mean, I argue, I created this system that, there is the left and the right, and then there is the best things are yet to come, the best things have already happened. And I argue that it used to be that kind of the wokes, which is yet the best things are yet to come because the past was bad, and the traditional conservatives, which is, the past was good, so the best things have already happened. It's no longer the kind of defining axis in politics. It's much more what I call the autist culture. So I kind of like dump all of tech, EA, a lot of econ into that, which is the best things are yet to come because because the future will be good. So it's a positive statement. And then what I call public nostalgics, who are in the left quadrant with the best things have already happened, who just say that the past was good. No, sorry, no, the future will be bad. So the future will be bad,
yeah.
And I call this kind of the hope axis. And I just started a podcast called The Hope Axis. I just did the first episode with Noah Smith. And in this, basically, I argue that I want more hubris, but hubris in the humanities. Because we constantly decry how hubristic technology and autist culture are, but where's the big idea in the humanities or even the social sciences? I mean, it's been 20 years, at least 15 years since the real last introduction of an idea in the humanities or social sciences where you walk out of a lecture hall and you're like, what the was that? But then 4 hours later, you still find yourself talking about it with your friends. Like, I want those ideas. I'm pretty sure when the Tainter book came out, I mean, we're still, 40 years later, we're still sitting here talking about it, which is pretty impressive. So I'm like, we need more hubris in the humanities. And this is like, I'm just going to keep repeating it until somebody dares to step up and say something outrageous on the stage. Like, I want that to happen on Interintellect. There's an Interintellect event where people are like, did you just say that? You must be kidding. Like, I want to see those faces, We have a bunch of questions. Eli, you were first, and then Sam.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Eli. I read the blog post and I got the Tainter book. So I will read it like immediately. Thank you. Because I'm working on something on a project, and I think the reference is great. And I wanted to ask you two questions actually. The first one, you talk about the this societies that have collapsed in a way, right? And you talk about the 2 points are the energy, like how do your societies import energy, like for instance, the Roman Empire was able to through looting, being able to capture the energy from the foodstuffs that they were capturing, getting back to their country. But I wanted to ask you something about the societies that were listed there. Have any other societies been able to fix themselves before they collapse? Like, are there any good examples of societies?
Like natural or intervention?
In any way possible. Like, I just don't what would be the
like Saudi Arabia finding oil? Magic.
Well, like I don't know whether that's the
Which is, by the way,
like,
a really good example of like temporarily fixing something super dysfunctional with just a little bit of energy
but yeah,
reset.
that could work. Like that might be possible. That's one question. And the other one was I think Taylor presented like a paper that was browsing, and it talks about a little bit about the issue about redundancy and complexity. So when is redundancy, how does redundancy become, because redundancy actually is very good for some systems in order for them to be robust, right? Um, but when does redundancy become bad complexity? Like, how does that? Because you could actually argue that the Hayekian argument would be like, okay, the state becomes this huge thing, right? And it's unmanageable, and it is and it becomes this handicap for development. But what would be a good example of a state that has like institutions that are redundant in order to be resilient, but does not affect complexity like in a bad way.
Okay, so great questions. So I'll take the first one first. The sort of which societies have not collapsed, right? So I think what we could, like, Tainter defines collapse like in a specific way, which is like a rapid decrease in social complexity, like rapid meaning on the order of, a couple decades, you have, 90% less complexity, something like that, right? That's the view he's thinking about. And so outside of the societies he lists, like almost like no societies have collapsed, right? So or maybe he missed a couple, but most societies have either continued to this day or ended for other reasons. So either they had a much slower decline and were, maybe co-opted by somebody, they were invaded by somebody and taken over, or for some other reason. But actually, so I would say probably like most societies, don't get to that point, or haven't gotten to that point. And then I think the other thing that that Tainter talks about is how this applies to societies when they are encroached upon by neighbors, by peer polities, he calls them, right? So if you have, if you think about like the Netherlands, it's hard to imagine the Netherlands collapsing, because even if they did, they have neighbors who could just roll in there with tanks and just like take over the territory and just be have new territory now. Whether or not their neighbors like are itching to do that is a separate question. But like the idea, like when you have societies just basically encroaching upon each other, I think it like collapse takes a different form, which is generally invasion. And so that is a different case. So
And
so
also
I think we can
closely related, right? I mean, it's usually like
yes, closely. It could be that they would have collapsed.
End of Hamlet, right? Like to stick with your Scandinavian example, that Fortin Russ comes in at the end because he can. One of the, I mean, when I was in college, Apocalypto came out and everybody loved the movie, hated Mel Gibson, but like it's a movie where people run. That's exciting. Have you guys seen this movie? And basically at the end, you see the Mesoamerican collapse, and then the conquistadors arrive. And of course, this is not how it went, but these two things are closely related. I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine. Both the fragility of the invader and the fragility of the prey play an important role here.
Yeah, so for most of human history, these societies have been isolated enough that they could collapse without just the neighbors walking in. So I think that so that's the comparison set is societies that either survived longer or survived long enough to die by some other means, or survived to this day. So in terms of redundancy, I think obviously like it makes sense to invest some in redundancy. I think the question is, like what is the marginal cost of the redundancy? So look at the redundancy as a value that we want to have, as a benefit, right? And how much are we paying on the margin for how much redundancy, right? And I think there's a lot of cases where, you know, an investment in redundancy makes sense and adds, you know, adds value, like sort of in expected terms across the distribution. But it probably requires the population to think in that way, right? To think in terms of expected benefits rather than just intangible benefits. And maybe they don't always, right? I think we all know, like, you know, like a lot of voters probably don't think in that way. So I think you actually have to just like perform well, you know, sort of these social functions well, you know, not including that, and then have a little bit of like elites need a little bit of slack from the population to sort of advocate for that redundancy and add it in, because I do agree that it's valuable, but like so you have, the elites have to be kind of trusted by the population, I think, for that to work. And I think this is, you know, another way of stating the problem, right? Is that the population loses trust in elites, and ultimately, like, that is kind of what leads to collapse. So yeah, I mean, I agree that redundancy can be valuable, but you do have to think about in cost benefit terms, and then the way you get it is by executing well on all the other societal functions.
I really want to take the Sam and Grant's questions, and also I hope that there will remain some time, or maybe their questions will lead us to talking a little bit about contemporary American society. I mean, that's the second half of your paper. But I just want to add one note, which is that, you know, we have, and this is kind of to go back to the Neumann, you know, when you discover the steam engine, every organism seems like a steam engine. When you discover the computer, everything, the brain looks like a computer. And when we will invent something new, we will see the brain as such. But I think the anthropomorphism is an even older instinct, and we kind of anthropomorphize a lot of very complex processes. And here, you know, we're basically talking about the life cycle of an empire or of a system as if it was a human being, right? That at the beginning is very fresh and vulnerable, and then it reaches adulthood when it's at kind of like its peak, and then there's an inevitable decline. And, you know, this might be correct. I mean, a system and a human being are subject to the same entropic forces within the physical system. It doesn't matter, like, we're systems just at different levels of complexity. But I wonder if it gives us a kind of bias, and maybe this works in a completely different way than human or organisms in general. But I remember I recently came up on this thing called negligible senescence. Do you guys know what this is? I didn't know that certain reptiles, like turtles, they don't die unless you just, like, they are like Meryl Streep in that movie When She Lives Forever. You know, like, you have to like violently attack them. The crocodiles as well. It's really scary.
Yep.
Oh my God. So what if like systems have some kind of negligible senescence? I don't know how to pronounce it properly. And they don't actually decay. Like, if you leave them up on a mountain somewhere in Southern America, they also perish because of some outside invasion, but maybe the invasion is very tiny and called the plague, you know, or some kind of thing that messes up your agricultural output. So this is kind of just like a note, and then I'm going to go to Sam, and if it comes up as a response later, that's fine.
Sure. Thanks, Eli. Really good post, really interesting stuff. And I got the book as a result, and I really enjoyed that as well.
Hope you're getting commission at least.
No commission.
Is Tainer even around still? I don't know. I didn't.
He is. So he is
Nice.
still in the natural resource department at Utah State University.
Wow, nice.
That's negligible senescence for you.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
So I noticed in reading it and in your post as well that the theory talks about societal complexity generally, but then when it goes into talking about the specific examples, it seems like most of the examples talk about the complexity of governance systems being sort of the examples of what led to the decline. And so I'm curious, must those be coupled? And if they, like, is a potential solution, what you're advocating, that you could have a society that remains at its level of complexity or continues to grow, but the governance systems themselves become less complex, and how long could that be sustained?
It's a super interesting question. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think obviously, like, our governance systems are in some sense a choice variable, right? Like we sort of collectively, some of it's spontaneous order, but like it's a spontaneous order of like human decisions. So like on some level, we have some control over it, and you could imagine a world where there is complexity in the sense of there's firms, there's people who run those firms, there's hierarchy in that sense, there is control over resources, etc. But you have successfully pruned the coercive apparatus to not be as complex. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in that kind of solution, and I do think there is something that is different about coercive forms of complexity, right? This is like the it is like the administrator that uses the threat of violence ultimately on some level that generates the most resentment. That said, like, I do think there's also an element of, even if you have like a non-coercive form of complexity, I mean, the property system is, inherently, there's a coercive aspect to it in terms of like you're enforcing property. So you still need to like avoid resentment, and you still need to have, like, I think, broad-based buying into society, right? And so I think it matters that whatever system we have is able to have broad-based support, and so sharing the wealth. I don't mean necessarily redistribution, but I mean like sort of enabling people at all sort of skill levels, education levels, or whatever, to be productive, to have a growing, like, personally, like their own pie is growing, or their own piece of the pie is growing in absolute terms, from year over year, decade over decade, generation over generation. There are a couple of NBER papers that came out last year on zero sum economies and sort of attitudes and actual growth. So I found this research very interesting, because if they basically use a world values survey and a couple other surveys, including like some detailed surveys in I forget what, an African country, a sub-Saharan African country, and they basically across these like different sources, they found like a consistent correlation between like positive sum thinking and the level of economic growth that the respondent had experienced, like, in their country over their lifetime, or over in their formative years. And if you like personally, or your country like experiences like good economic outcomes, that's more likely to make you a positive sum thinker. And then of course the causality flows in the other direction too, right? If you are if you're in a society of all zero sum thinkers, you're not going to have a lot of economic growth. And so I think like that literature, like, or those literature, it's two papers, but those two papers like sort of consolidated for me, like what is actually maybe at issue here is just like, are we delivering sort of positive sum realities to everybody? And if we're kind of like not doing that over some extended period of time, either because you have too many administrators or you're too much complexity, or some other reason, like that is maybe what puts us at most risk. So that's how I would think about it. It's like, yes, it's important to prune the coercive complexity, but also make sure that we're delivering growth to broad base of society so that people don't get demoralized and jaded.
Thank you so much. Grant?
Thanks. So really interesting. I wish we had like another 6 hours because this is such a fruitful kind of opportunity to go down. And for what
Welcome to my life. It's like,
Yeah.
oh no. And when you have a 6-hour salon, you're like, this salon should have been a weekend
Yeah.
retreat. It's like we're the opposite of like this meeting should have been an email. This email should have been a tweet. We're like a complexifier society.
Exactly. So for what it's worth, in your last point, Eli, I think as I was reading through in my own experience, I work at a wealth management firm with ultra high net worth individuals. And it's funny how even the people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, not just the people who don't feel like they're catching up, still have this nihilistic degrowth mindset, which I found really interesting when I joined that field, which I've only been in for a brief period of time, but that it gets that hope access piece. Do you think that the best is, behind you, or do you think that there's
Catching on.
Yeah, is
Catching
there
on.
opportunity
Hope
out in
I
front?
bought the domain, so it's mine.
I saw. So I think that's a really interesting point, but maybe piggybacking on Sam's question a little bit, thinking about like complexity of governance and is that the crucial variable, coordination problems, like what's driving some of this, and going, okay, if you wanted to use your term to like prune complexity in some ways, like what are the avenues to do that? And so I believe it was like cutting the Gordian knot, and I was struggling to come up with examples where we took complexity out of out of an existing framework. Or do you have to just replace it? Like, do you have to fundamentally replace it? So the example that I would put to you is like an example to see if this fits or how you would respond is substitution effect the answer? So for instance, is it possible that solar is outcompeting nuclear not because it's the lowest cost per megawatt, but is it possible that it's just a less regulated, more distributed energy, and so the way to actually get your energy subsidy is not new tech in terms of megawatt per cent. It really is like megawatt per level of complexity related to this. And so you're seeing data centers like contract with energy producers. They don't even have to worry about transmission and the grid. They're just going to do their own billion-dollar deal, or you see Stripe staying private instead of going public and dealing with all the complexity. Like, is there a substitution effect here that really is the way out of this complexity problem, as opposed to trying to like revise NEPA?
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, I think we should do both, right? Like revise NEPA and also think about this other stuff. So I'll tell you like some of the discussions that I've had with my friend Ben Reinhardt, and I don't think I'm outing him here. He's written about this, but I think he's very interested in technologies that are simplifying, right? In sort of the sense, maybe at least in a related sense to what you're talking about. And so if you think about something like if we want to colonize Mars, right? Like we're gonna have to like send 20 people or something like that on the first boat. Like maybe less, right? And they're going to have to be able to produce a wide array of things that they need to survive. Obviously, we'll send cargo and stuff, but they have to do like a significant amount of production, with support from Earth. But it's quite a lot. And so what we need to make that viable is technologies that don't depend on very complex supply chains, that are simple to operate, right? That are simple to assemble, that and so on. And then and I think your solar point is very apt. I would also put like lithium ion batteries in that category. Like anything that is solid state and is like relatively easy to manufacture ends up having like learning rate in manufacturing that like pushes it towards like the cost of it towards just cost of materials, just because the manufacturing process gets so efficient over time. And I do think that like sort of a push towards technologies like that A are like simple to manufacture and use, and then B like that don't have the same safety considerations, and that like sort of are able to have to, you know, avoid sort of the you know, excessive safetyism in regulation, right? Like that might be a good promising way forward. But I mean, I do think we need to try all of the above. You know, I think I'm very like non-complacent on this, and I want all of it. I want all of it because I want to see what the, you know, what the future can be like, and I worry that if we go down the current path, like we may not get there.
I think it's relevant. I would say your lithium example is really interesting just from the standpoint of, you know, I wonder if it's out ahead of the regulation hasn't caught up. At some point, someone can say, well, you're mining this way, and how are you doing this? And like the regulations start to pour in a little, like you're seeing with AI. And I do worry that you get it's not just the pure technological piece, but it's the, like, how quickly can you deploy your technology and strategy for progress before the regulation and complexity catches up?
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about ultra-dense lithium batteries, and partially as an investor in one company that's like working on this. And as they get denser, like lithium batteries do end up looking quite a bit like bombs, right? Like they have a lot of energy in them, and a fast release, like, you know, ends up being rather bomb-like. And yeah, and so far the regulators, you know, there's these like airplane regulations, you can't have like certain batteries in the cargo hold or whatever, but other than that, like there hasn't been too much concern yet. So it's true, we gotta move fast here.
Thank you so much. And I think we're a little bit over time, but this has been absolutely fascinating. And like, what are you working on after this? Like, what, I think you created a kind of magnum opus in blogosphere terms. What are you working on now? Are you going to write a couple of pieces responding to those responding to you? Is this a conversation? Or are you, you know, going into classical music? Like what something like this?
So my current project is I'm working on a book. So I'm working on a book on you know, why we're stagnating, and looking across a bunch of industries for like commonalities of why that is. And so yeah, I'm very much still thinking you know, in these terms, but also just more on a positive level, like here's the upside to if we can unblock progress in like a few different pathologies of obstacle, or if we can get rid of a few of them, it has huge dividends in a bunch of sectors of the economy. And you know, here's what the upside looks like if we unblock those.
I love this. I'm always here for more progress studies stuff. And we do have a progress studies channel on our Discord in Interintellect. And I think there are quite a few people deeply dedicated to this cause. Even those more agnostic, I think, are quite like they are open. You know, they might be coming from very, very different angles or walks of life, but they are open to considering these often quite quite convincing arguments that it's not going to fix itself, right? It's a kind of disease, and we are all we have. I mean, this is why I studied Interintellect. I wanted to be a writer and an academic, and thought my life would be like, you know, I party in my 20s, and then in my 30s I write from bed like Proust. And then you realize, like, no, there's stuff to do, and there's nobody else to go to. Like, it's us. We are doing what we want to see in the world. And I think there's something beautiful about this paradox of determinism, that it's both, if you don't intervene, it's deterministic, and if you do, it's not. I just absolutely love that. One of the things I'm working on, I have a new essay series that I think will also be a book, is a little bit the relationship between truthfulness and changing things. The more I or like the truthfulness as a not just as the opposite of lying, but of empty speech. And I think empty speech is also a symptom of decadence and a symptom of nihilism. Like, you're saying the words, you know, like in late communism, you still are performing the empty ritual. And coming from a former communist country, I do take that pretty seriously. Like it's not a superficial problem. And I think when as we return to earnestness, as we return to embracing our own responsibility, we're also returning to a kind of unironic speech where you can still be eloquent, you can still be poetic and philosophical, but you have to say what you mean. It's not enough to start a podcast. It's not enough to just asking questions. No, finish your sentence. Tell me the things you are questioning, the things you are nostalgic about, the things you are insinuating or mocking. Then what? Like, okay, you can think that, like, you know, intellectual pluralism, but then what do you want instead? Like, what are you proposing? And I think the more we get to very clean speech, when you say what your problem is, what do you want to see instead, I think that the faster we will be able to address what needs to be addressed. So I was very pleased to see that at Tainter and you are kind of anti-decadence in this sense, because it's almost like a Derridean way of saying that language is the problem where language is the solution, and you create this circular argument or argumentation. No, like language is really important to understand what this person is talking about and to judge whether they are competent or intellectually honest, but it's not a linguistic problem.
Yeah.
You sometimes have the most, you know, futuristic science fiction and movies in very decadent eras. Like you look at the 90s, right? Like all 90s cinema was about heroism and you know, abundance. And it was, you know, I mean, we can argue, but it was not necessarily the most constructive period in our lives. So I'm very, very excited to read your book and to have you back when it's out. But when is it out? Do you have a?
Oh, it'll be a while. I'm about 25% of the way through the manuscript. So
feel free to come back earlier. We're always here
okay.
to this, and maybe we can bring Ben. Like Ben has been to do intern excellence, but then he realized that he would have to come and sit there, and then it was like too much. So let's decomplexify this. He can call, he can text us, okay? Everybody will have WhatsApp open and Ben will send texts. We'll figure it out. Thank you so much, guys. This has been a total pleasure. I look forward to debating this some more with you on Discord. And Eli, enjoy Edge Esmeralda. Say hi from us to Devon. We are huge fans.
Okay.
And I wish you the best.
Will do.
As well.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a great discussion.
Take care,
really
guys.
Appreciate it.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.